Avowed is a game made by Obsidian Entertainment and published by Xbox Game Studios, and it was one of those RPGs that was very divisive amongst the critics and fans alike. So after finally finishing the game myself, I have done the main story, rolled the credits. I've done a whole bunch of side stuff, and managed to get all the skill points required. And after going through the entire game, it's safe to say that Avowed as an RPG is a Jekyll and Hyde type of game. And what I mean by Jekyll and Hyde type of game is one half of Avowed I think is really, really good. The other half of Avowed I feel is incredibly mid and towards the side of bad. So let's get into it. We're going to start off with the good when it comes to Avowed. First and foremost, the overall presentation when it comes to visuals and audio. Avowed is a beautiful looking game. The world design, the way the colors are, the art style that they went with is utmost top tier. The amount of times where I stopped to enjoy the scenery, both in terms of how far the draw distance is in the game, to the architecture, to the art style, everything about Avowed looked and sounded great. The musical score was also great, and all of this is accompanied by a great performance by the voice acting.
Unlike most Adirans who couldn't find their ass with both their hands. Oh, present company excluded. They told me you were godlike, but I didn't know what to expect.
The voice acting is really, really good across all the characters that I've interacted with, and overall, it just makes the presentation of Avowed really, really good. When it comes to the gameplay aspect and what part of Avowed is great in terms of gameplay is the exploration and the world design. Avowed does a very good job of when you're out in the world and you're exploring of giving you points of interest of where you're like, oh, what's over there? What's over here? And then next thing you know, you find a secret chest, you find a secret boss fight, you find a shrine. There's always something to find, and you're always rewarded for exploration. And of course, the exploration is also really fun because of how good the parkour is in this game. Climbing, vaulting, jumping, platforming, it feels really, really good, even when you're playing from a first-person perspective. Normally, first-person shooters are a little iffy when it comes to platforming, but when you're playing it in Avowed, they did a really good job. So it makes the element and the aspect of exploring the world that they created a lot of fun, and I just always enjoyed looking around and enjoying the scenery. This, of course, is all accompanied by great, great combat. The combat in Avowed, to me, is fantastic. Regardless of what weapon combination you're using or what abilities you are using, it is a lot of fun, and the combat does require some strategy. It's not mindless if you're playing on the normal difficulty. You do want to play to the strengths and weaknesses of each character or each enemy that you're facing. I started with a melee build that transitioned into a mage melee build where I was a hybrid of both melee damage as well as spellcasting, and it was just a lot of fun to just engage in combat. Despite the fact that the enemy variety is limited, it was still a lot of fun to just constantly engage in combat and explore the game world, and I think this is where Avowed shines the best. This is where Avowed is at its best. When it comes to some of the things that about Avowed that I'm a little iffy on, one of which comes in the form of the loot system and the way the game progresses with leveling. Essentially, while you do have multiple trees to go through, you only really get 25 skill points. So that's not even enough to fill out an entire class. So you really have to be specific with what you want. And then what makes it worse is when you combine it with the loot system. So the way the loot system and progression works in this game is you need to upgrade your armor, not by replacing the gear, but by going to your camp, and from there what you want to do is you want to use the materials to upgrade the weapon that you're using. What this means is that it's counterintuitive to the combat itself. While the combat does encourage using a variety of weapons and different combinations, the difficulty of the game scales with how strong the weapon itself is. So you don't want to keep or hoard multiple weapons. You want to break down as many weapons as you can for the materials and then upgrade the one main weapon that you're using. In my case, I had a sword that had lifesteal and flame damage. And because I had this sword, I just kept upgrading it. And I got this sword in the beginning of the game, and I never switched off for the rest of the game. Every other piece of gear that I got, even if it was a signature gear, I basically dismantled. Because what happens is if I try to switch, it would be of a lower tier than my sword, and then the game would get harder because the difficulty of the game is tied to how strong your armor is. So the game rewards you for upgrading the same piece of armor, not replacing it. And what makes matters worse is that there's not enough materials to go around without excessive grinding in order to constantly switch. So if you start with using a sword and then you want to go to a double-handed axe, for example, you're going to have to do a lot of grinding to upgrade that axe. And while you can go to shops and buy the items, they are very expensive for the rarity that you're going to already be at. And you don't get enough gold unless you grind. So the loot system in this game conceptually is good, but the execution is flawed, and that's the big issue. Like, I did find some cool signature weapons and gear, but once you find the one that you like, you're basically stuck with it for the rest of the game, and you never switch off. The other issue that I had that was a bit of the iffy is when it comes to the conversation choice lines. So you are presented with choices when you're in conversations and dialogues with other NPCs. A lot of the choices, whether it's a main or a side, means nothing. You can make a choice, and then the very next conversation you have with that person, it's like that choice didn't even matter. However, there are some choices that you can make in the main quest that then might impede a side quest. Where later on, because you made this decision as part of the main story, now you did the side quest, because of that choice, you get this option. Whereas if you chose differently, that option will not present itself. It's very inconsistent with what choices matter and what choices don't. Whereas when you play a game like Mass Effect, for example, every choice matters. Now let's get into the real negatives of Avowed and what I found to be the biggest flaws with Avowed. First and foremost, the story and characters themselves. The main story is not good. Not good at all. I was not impressed, and it didn't grab me at all. And the characters themselves, majority of the characters, other than perhaps one or two characters, I found uninteresting. There's just, while the voice acting in this game, as I stated earlier, is really good, voice acting cannot replace the writing. And if the story isn't good, if the characters aren't good, no matter how good the performance is, it's not going to change the fact that the character or story is just not good. And that's one of the flaws with Avowed. Now, this is an RPG. This is not a game like Tokyo Extreme Racer where the story doesn't matter. No, this is an RPG. People play RPGs to get immersed in the story and the world, and they don't deliver it here in terms of the story and narrative. Also, another issue I had, specifically when it comes to the PC version, at least of the game, is performance and crashes. The game has crashed on me multiple times throughout my playthrough, and I've had multiple frame dips throughout my playthrough. Now, typically when I set up my stuff for my PC, the way I set up the game, I always prioritize frame rate, and I always maintain at minimum 60 frames per second. So if I have to sacrifice fidelity to do so, I willingly do so all the time. And despite my best efforts, at times there was no way to actually get the frame rate to not be dropping. I'm not saying I have to run the game at 150 FPS, but just to get a consistent 60, there were moments where, it was noticeably dropping. And it was dropping during the intense particle areas, but it's just like, I dialed the settings pretty low. Even lower than what the game recommended when I set it up. So, and I have a pretty good rig. Not the best rig, but at this point in time, it's still very good, and it's stronger than what's in the consoles. And yet, maintaining a good frame rate plus the crashes was, it was an issue for me. On top of the bugs, I've experienced a few bugs where One bug, I got stuck in a piece of debris that was part of a building, and I couldn't get out. I had to reload my game. I've had quests that glitched out on me where I had to again reload my game. So performance crashes, bugs, yeah, there's a bunch of jank in this game, and it did deter my experience somewhat. But overall, I feel like Avowed was an enjoyable time, despite not being the best game I've ever played. Did I have fun? Yes. I enjoyed Avowed when I wasn't doing the main narrative stuff. When I am out in the world, exploring at my leisure, in combat, that is when the game is at its best. However, that other half, being an RPG, is, well, you gotta go in town. You gotta have dialogue. You're gonna have cutscenes. And it's gonna be a slog. That's what it felt to me. Very much a slog combined with with performance issues. So when I take those performance issues and I take the fact that the story's not very good, that the characters aren't very good, and that the loot system isn't the greatest, half of my time of this game, it was a slog to me. It was a slog. The other half of the game, however, exploring, combat, fighting bosses, I enjoyed. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really good. So to me, Avowed is a mixed bag, and its Metacritic score does reflect the game. How hard you hit it will depend on how the story connects with you, in my opinion. If you connect with the characters more, if you connect with the story more, you will get far more enjoyment out of Avowed. But if the story is unable to grab you, if the characters are unable to interest you, then you're going to look at Avowed and say this is more of a mid-game, especially considering that the RPG genre has so many bangers that have come out over the years that you would just look at Avowed and be like, yeah, it's okay. So where do I stand? How do I grade Avowed? Well, me, personally, I only recommend playing Avowed if you're playing it through Game Pass or if you get it on a deep sale. I would say at least 50% off. Mainly because, in my opinion, half of this game, specifically with the story and characters, I expect them to iron out the performance issues and crashes, but in terms of the characters and the actual story, that's half of the game. And I was not interested, and I did not have fun for that half of the game. But when it comes to exploring, when it comes to combat, I had a lot of fun. So overall, for me, I'm giving Avowed a 6.5 out of 10. I recommend it on Game Pass. I recommend it on a deep sale. But other than that, I would not pay full price or recommend someone pay full price for this game when there's so many other better RPGs available. This is Veteran Gamer, and I hope to see you guys next time.